Hi, I'm Celine. I never thought the worst betrayal of my life would come from inside my own family. My sister-in-law told me my son was just tired, but hours later, nurses found him unresponsive. His hospital alarm had been pulled. I trusted her like a sister. Now I can't stop asking myself, how long had she planned it? And why didn't anyone stop her? Family was always complicated, but never cruel. That's what I used to believe. That belief sat with me as I stood by my son's hospital bed, the muted beeping of machines cutting through the antiseptic air. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long strips of light across his pale face. He was 8, too young for this room, too young to be tethered to machines because of some rare post-surgery complication. The doctors said he was recovering, but recovery looked a lot like silence. He hadn't said much in days. I sat there, holding his hand, listening to the rhythm of his breath more than any words he no longer said. My sister-in-law had started visiting more frequently. At first, it felt like kindness. She'd offer to sit with him while I went home to shower or picked up groceries. "Go, I've got him," she'd insist, too cheerful, too reassuring. And I didn't think to question kindness, especially when it came in the form of family. But there was something off. The tone in her voice when I explained his medication schedule. The way she double-checked the alarm system and casually remarked, "This thing's overly sensitive. It goes off even if he shifts a little." She knew the system too well. That should have struck me, but I let it slide. "You're too sensitive. Kids are tougher than we think," she'd say after I worried aloud about his appetite or his mood. Her voice always carried that tone, half joke, half dismissal. I used to laugh it off. I didn't want to stir conflict. I told myself it was just her way. Some people speak bluntly. Some people don't know how to be gentle. And maybe I was just tired. We were all tired. But when my son started asking me to stay longer, that was different. "Mom, can you not leave next time?" he whispered one afternoon, eyes avoiding mine. I smiled, rubbed his forehead. "I'll try not to, baby." He didn't respond, just turned toward the window. That silence sank its claws in deep. I blamed the hospital, the cold lighting, the endless hours. I blamed everything but what I should have been seeing. Then came the incident. I'd stepped out for just under an hour. When I returned, chaos. Nurses rushing in, the room tense. My son's oxygen levels had dipped dangerously low, but the alarm never triggered. One of the nurses frowned, checking the monitor. "It's strange someone would have had to mute this manually." I froze. "What do you mean, mute it? It doesn't mute on its own." My heart sank. My sister-in-law was gone. Left for coffee, apparently. No one had seen her in the last 30 minutes. I stood there, the hum of machines suddenly louder, sharper. Who would silence a child's alarm? I didn't say anything, not then. Instead, I walked straight to the hospital bathroom, locked the door, and stared at myself in the mirror. My hands trembled. My stomach twisted. I wanted to believe it was just a mistake. Some technical fault. Maybe the system glitched. Maybe the nurse was wrong. Maybe. But then my mother's voice echoed in my mind. She passed years ago, but I remember her saying once, "If something feels wrong, it probably is." And something was wrong. I pressed my back to the wall, slid down to the cold tile floor, and cried silently. Not because I was scared. Because I was starting to see what I didn't want to see. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was a warning. When I stepped out of that bathroom, I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't confront. I smiled when I passed the nurses. I thanked my sister-in-law when she returned with her coffee, saying the line she always did, "Sorry, line was long." I nodded, and then I started watching. Every movement, every interaction, every word. That night, I began journaling. Timestamps, observations. I needed more than a hunch. I needed proof, and proof takes patience. I ordered a discreet camera online. I told myself I wasn't being paranoid, I was being prepared. Because I wasn't weak for needing clarity. I was strong for refusing to ignore what was right in front of me. And I didn't need to accuse her. I just needed the truth to reveal itself. The nurse came to me the next afternoon when I was refilling my son's water cup. She didn't speak loudly, just leaned in slightly and asked, "Do you know if anyone touched the settings on the monitor yesterday?" I blinked. "No." "Why?" She hesitated. "Just curious. We had to recalibrate it." It looked like the alarm was muted manually. I nodded, pretending it was news to me. Inside, I could hear the hinges of memory creak open, Bridget's voice echoing, "This system's overly sensitive. It'll buzz even if he breathes too hard." I'd laughed it off back then. Now it felt like a red flag I'd ignored. From that moment, I stopped assuming. I started tracking arrival times, what she touched, what she said, and what didn't quite add up. Trust, but verify. My father used to say that. He raised 3 daughters by himself. Taught us to lock the door even in broad daylight. Taught us not to mistake familiarity for safety. That lesson came back fast. A couple days later, I picked up Oliver from school. He'd had a checkup scheduled, and I wanted to grab him early to avoid traffic. We didn't speak much in the car, just the soft buzz of the heater and the quiet click of the blinker. Seattle fog rolled in thick, like it wanted to hide something. At a red light, he looked out the window and said, "Can Aunt Bridget not stay with me anymore?" I turned slightly. Why? He didn't meet my eyes. Just shrugged. "She watches me weird." I didn't ask more. I didn't need to. I'd felt it too. I reached over, touched his knee gently. "Okay." That night, I wrote it down. I started a notebook. Not for accusations. For facts. For memory. Because I knew what would come later, questions, doubts, people telling me I imagined it. But children, they may not have hard proof. But their instincts? They know. And Oliver was telling me something. A few days after that, I struck up a casual chat with a front desk nurse. I'd brought her a coffee and thanked her for her help. People open up when you treat them like people. After a bit of small talk, I asked about visitor logs. Said I was trying to track how often I was missing Bridget's visits. The nurse smiled and let me peek. That's when I saw it. The day of the alarm incident, Bridget had signed out almost 40 minutes before the alarm went silent. She hadn't just stepped out. She wasn't even in the building. There were only 2 explanations. Someone else tampered with the system. Or she lied. And either way, it was bad. I sat in the hospital cafeteria later, staring at that thought. My fingers wrapped around a paper cup that had gone cold. My brain fought itself, protect the family or protect my child. You already know the answer. I placed a small voice recorder in my purse that night. Just a precaution. Bridget showed up the next day like clockwork. A box of muffins in hand, the too cheerful smile plastered on. She complimented my hair, my parenting, my calm. I watched her closely. Every time she touched Oliver's arm, I checked his face. And once, I saw it, his jaw tighten, his fingers curl slightly. He didn't move away, but his whole body seemed to want to. She looked over at me. "He's always so needy when you're around," she said with a short laugh. "It's like he performs being fragile for you." I smiled. Pressed record in my purse. After she left, I sat on the hospital bench near the vending machines. I thought about when I was 8, too. There was someone in our extended family who made me uncomfortable. I told my mom once. She waved me off, said I was dramatic. That I'd seen too many crime shows. That people in families don't do those things. But sometimes, they do. And when they do, silence doesn't protect anyone. That memory stung. I held onto it as I tucked Oliver in later that night, brushing his hair back from his forehead. He was already half asleep. I whispered, "I see you. I will never doubt what I see again." The next morning, I printed the visitor logs. Kept a digital copy, too. I started talking to a couple nurses, asking harmless questions, keeping their names written down just in case. I didn't tell my husband. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I couldn't afford to have doubt spread too soon. He'd dismiss it, try to mediate, maybe even defend her. I couldn't have that. You don't accuse the storm, I told myself. You board the windows and wait until it's close enough to name. I made a plan. I was going to invite Bridget for an overnight. She'd offered before, said it'd give me rest, give her time with her favorite nephew. I'd declined, always gently. This time, I would say yes. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. I pulled the old journal out of the drawer late one night. My son was asleep beside me, the monitor's quiet hum like a steady pulse in the dark. The pages weren't meant for this. Written when Oliver was 5, a little boy with a brave smile and a fragile heart. But there were notes, random nausea, unexplained drowsiness, visits with my sister-in-law every time. I had dismissed the pattern then. This time I could not. We ignore the oddities we don't want to believe. I wrote that line long ago, then crossed it out. Tonight I underlined it. Bridget had said, "It's just a sensitive tummy." It sounded small at the time. Now it felt like the first knot in a rope that would pull me under. His exhaustion this week echoed those old pages. His tiny body slumping on the sofa, refusing dinner. My voice in the dark. This isn't just tiredness. The next morning, the school counselor called. Her voice was soft but firm. "I'm concerned," she said. Oliver seemed withdrawn on the days Bridget picked him up. He told her, "I like school because no one whispers about me there." My chest tightened. If even the system notices something, why did I hesitate? I asked for a meeting, asked questions. Her parting words. "What you allow is what will continue." I heard the echo of that advice in my mind as I hung up the phone. Later that day, I sat in front of my computer, logged into the pharmacy account for Oliver's prescriptions. A glance at the refill dates stirred my stomach. They were early, without my authorization, and they matched the weeks Bridget had claimed she was running errands. My heart beat too fast. I called the pharmacy, posed casually as a nurse verifying records. They confirmed Bridget picked up meds under my name, saying I was busy. Impersonation. Endangerment. My mind raced through legal definitions while my face remained still. That evening, I asked Oliver a quiet question while tucking him in. "Do you remember who gave you that medicine that made you sleepy last month?" He looked up with trust and shook his head. "Aunt Bridget said it was the good kind, the one that lets me nap." I didn't flinch. I covered my surprise with calm. "Next time, only mommy gives you those, okay?" He nodded and handed me a drawing, our house, and he had shaded Aunt Bridget's figure black. My throat felt raw, my rage and sorrow intertwined. She was drugging my child under the guise of care. The night was long. I met my lawyer friend for coffee, no filing yet, just strategy. She warned, "Build your story with bricks, not feathers." I nodded, thinking about how I had built this family on hopes and trust. She also advised me to talk to the admin at the hospital, quietly, without naming names. So I did. I requested tighter access logs, asked about surveillance. I walked out of that meeting with no fanfare, but a plan. When I returned home, I found a soup container on my doorstep. Bridget's writing on the lid. "You're looking stressed, let me help with Oliver this weekend." I paused. Time stretched. I declined. "We're doing some one-on-one time." Her eyes flicked annoyance, her smile cold. Later, I overheard Oliver whisper as I tucked him in, "Mommy, please don't leave me alone with her." I dropped to my knees beside him, held him. "I won't," I promised quietly. In that moment a truth set in. I wouldn't fight with volume. I would fight with truth, and witnesses. My resolve tightened. I wasn't going to shout. I was going to show. I was going to expose the pattern. And I was done allowing. Done waiting. Done doubting. I said yes to the dinner invitation. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see it for myself, how far the story had spread, how deep it had rooted. It was hosted at the Kersey estate, all polished oak and hollow warmth. Bridget met me at the door like we were old friends reunited, hands clasped over mine like I hadn't seen through her 5 layers of fake. "So glad you came," she said. "You deserve a night off after everything. I've been stepping in so much lately with Oliver. I don't mind, of course." Her smile never touched her eyes. Deirdre, always regal in her posture and passive in her poison, leaned over Oliver and cooed, "You're so lucky to have Auntie Bridget." I watched her fingers curl gently around his shoulder. Oliver stiffened. Just for a second. No one noticed. But I did. I sat there, listening to the hum of clinking silverware and perfectly timed laughs, realizing I wasn't invited for company. I was the context. A frame to highlight someone else's portrait. We moved into the dining room, crystal glasses filled, silver catching candlelight. Bridget, naturally, was seated at the window, light haloing her like some saint in a painting. Deirdre orchestrated it all with a well-trained hand. "Celine, dear, why don't you sit next to Harlan?" I ended up across the table, partially blocked from view. A newspaper photographer hovered, snapping shots for some charity feature. I whispered to Harlan, "Am I invisible?" He looked away and fiddled with his napkin. Every photo framed Bridget perfectly, leaning toward Oliver, holding his hand, laughing as if joy poured from her. And I sat there, watching, witnessing. Sometimes being there means you still aren't seen. That line settled deep in my chest. The next morning, the newspaper hit the stands. I saw it while grabbing coffee. The front page headline, Bridget Kersey, champion for heart kids. Her smile stretched across the print, Oliver tucked under her arm like a prop. I stared. Not one mention of me. Not one sentence. No acknowledgement of the nights I slept in vinyl hospital chairs, the fevers I fought off, the alarms I memorized better than my own phone number. Recognition doesn't always follow effort. It follows image, and she crafted hers carefully. Recognition comes to those who claim it, not always those who earn it. That line didn't hurt me. It clarified me. I didn't need applause. I needed truth. And truth didn't pose for cameras. Later that day, I found Harlan in his study, leather-bound books, a humidor untouched. I asked him straight, why didn't anyone ask me about Oliver's care? He exhaled slowly. Your voice just didn't fit the image we were trying to show. That cut more than I expected. Because it meant this wasn't about care. It was optics. Theater. I walked out and didn't look back. In my car, I opened my notebook and wrote 2 words in capital letters, reclaiming visibility. If they wanted a polished version of the story, fine. I'd show them the parts they didn't want printed. I'd do it slowly, properly, because the one thing worse than being lied about is being erased. That night I locked the newspaper into a file folder. I added timestamped visitor logs, photos of Bridget at the hospital, always there when things went wrong. I downloaded security data from the hospital portal. Then, I called Laura, an old friend, now a journalist. Would you cover a story about a caregiver who becomes a silent threat? I didn't accuse. I asked. There's a difference. She agreed to listen. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was preparing. There's a quiet difference between revenge and proof. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for clarity. For the record to reflect reality. Just as I closed my laptop, the doorbell rang. Bridget stood there. Same smile. Same muffins. Baked fresh, she chirped. I thought you and Oliver might want a treat tonight. I took the container and nodded. Movie night. Sounds perfect. What she didn't know was that the recorder was already set, tucked beneath the TV stand. Saturday evening arrived with a quiet hope, one I'd engineered myself. I cooked chicken, roasted vegetables, pulled the blanket off that green canvas tote from the hospital, tucked it under my side table. I invited Bridget over for dinner, said we needed to reconnect for Oliver's sake. Under the surface I was setting a stage. The recorder sat snug beneath the table. My phone's voice memo was rolling, hidden between coasters and a glass of iced tea. Oliver was upstairs, headphones on, a movie playing. Safe. I took deep breaths in the living room and told myself, the calmer the sea, the more disoriented the predator when the storm hits. Bridget arrived, arms full of dessert. Her smile was bright, even festive. I thought it would be nice to make a treat for everyone, she said. I nodded and placed the dessert on the sideboard, asked, will you come in and help Oliver choose his movie when he's ready? She took the invitation, slipped into the boys' room. Her hand lingered on his bed. He turned away. I made the sauce for the chicken while 2 voices echoed in the hall, one small and hesitant, the other too eager. Dinner began. We passed plates, made light talk. She asked me how I was, again. I said I was doing fine, that Oliver seemed better. She nodded, leaned in. I'm just glad I was there for Oliver that day. She said, that day, like a triumph. I sipped my wine, held my floor. Which day is that? I asked quietly. She paused, lips parting. Oh, I mean, when the alarms went off. When, her eyes flicked to Oliver, who sat quietly with his dinner. I stepped in when I heard the beeping. The words hung. I waited. Then she corrected herself. I came right back in after I stepped out. Her voice changed, tense, too smooth. I smiled, calm, though my hands buzzed under the table. When someone's truth changes under pressure, it was never truth to begin with. She laughed and changed the subject. I let her. I watched her closely. The more casual the moment, the more cracks appeared. Then I shared a story, gentle but cutting. I talked about a mother in the same ward. Her son's alarm had been silenced by someone supposed to be helping. I didn't mention Bridget. But the effect landed. Her face hardened. "That's different," she said. "Sometimes people make honest mistakes." I asked, voice steady, "What's an honest mistake when a child's health is involved?" Her gaze shifted away. I remembered all the nights I'd sat by Oliver, eyes wide, holding his hand when the alarms wouldn't stop. All the times I'd waited. She didn't answer. She just said, "You always had the perfect excuse, didn't you?" The words flew. She changed the topic. After dinner, she asked if she could be listed as Oliver's emergency contact again. "Just in case," she added. I shook my head. "We're keeping things close-knit right now." The smile she offered me died in her eyes. "I did nothing wrong, you know," she whispered. I leaned back slowly. "I didn't say you did." She stood, early, gathered her empty plate. "Good night, Celine," she said and went out the door. I sat still, the clock ticking loud in the quiet room. I opened my phone, retrieved the recording, listened to her half-truths, her defensive tone, her laughter when she shouldn't have been laughing. My hands felt icy cold. I pressed pause. I labeled timestamps. I upload the file to a secure drive. Because I wasn't looking for guilt. I was documenting a pattern. In the early hours, I tucked Oliver into bed. He stared at me quietly, then said, "Mommy, are you going to make sure I'm okay?" "Yes," I promised. "And I'm going to make sure no one can ever ignore you again." Sunday morning, the message from Harlan popped up. "Bridget says you tried to ambush her." I stared at the screen. Her weapon was preemptive narrative. I typed, "Then let's talk. All three of us." Inside my mind I knew, I didn't just trap her. I triggered her fear. The final push begins, not with noise but with undeniable evidence. The house was still when the email came in. I sat at my desk, just past 6. Oliver was in the bath upstairs, humming off-key. I opened the message from Aileen Bixby, and what stared back at me stopped my breath. A memo, internal, buried, forwarded from Dr. Milton Hasker's office. Subject line, urgent. Review of unauthorized disconnection, cardiac alarm incident. There it was, in plain black and white. The line that changed everything. See Kersey visit 6-23. Logs indicate manual override, non-staff keycard used. A scrawl in pen at the bottom. Monitoring system compromised, investigate visitor breach. My hand hovered over the mouse. June 23rd. That was the day Bridget signed out. Said she'd just stepped out for a moment. I'd remembered it clearly because it was the same night Oliver had dipped, hard, and I'd had to fight for a full review. They never gave me one. Now I had this. I opened my notebook, flipped back to that week. I'd written it in black Sharpie, alarms muted. No nurse came. The time matched. The logs were no longer circumstantial, they were joined by a smoking gun. Eileen's note read simply, "Thought you'd want to see this. Handle with care." I wasn't just reading it, I was shaking. Not in fear, but clarity. I knew she knew how the system worked. And now, I had proof. I printed the memo, placed it in a folder alongside visitor logs, pharmacy receipts, and my journal entries from the week Oliver nearly coded. I pulled out a poster board, mapped a timeline. June 23rd, Bridget signs out. Alarm overridden, Oliver crashes. I called Trina Sorensen. She picked up on the second ring. "It's time," I said. "Slow," she replied. "Let them step into your circle first. Don't file. Let them get nervous." I leaned back in my chair, eyes locked on the stack of paper. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was a strategist. By 9:15 the next morning, I was standing in front of the hospital's administrative wing. I hadn't made an appointment. I didn't knock. Dr. Hasker looked up from his desk as I entered. His face did that neutral thing people do when they expect anger but hope for small talk. "Celine, what brings you in this morning?" I laid the folder on his desk, calm. "I have questions about Oliver's monitoring system. Why did the alarm never reach the nurse's station?" He blinked once. "Equipment occasionally fails. It happens. We show no record of." I opened the folder, pulled out the memo, slid it forward. He didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. Then, with a steady tone, "This was an internal review note. Not intended for families." I leaned in. "Yet here we are." He glanced up. "This will need to be handled carefully." I smiled. "I am." As I walked out, one of the security staff intercepted me by the elevator. Ma'am, we're just reminding visitors about the hospital's recording policies. No unauthorized devices on campus. My chest tightened. I remembered the recorder in my bag. The silent backup camera I kept clipped near my wallet. I kept walking. Noted. At home, Oliver ran into my arms. Did you win, Mommy? I pulled him close. We're just getting started. By midnight, I was back in my office. Coffee gone cold beside me, I charted state statutes on patient rights, medical sabotage, whistleblower protections. I highlighted lines in red. Emailed Trina encrypted backups. Saved copies to 2 different flash drives. Taped one under the drawer in my pantry. I started writing an op-ed, when the alarm meant nothing. The title sat like a weight on the screen. This wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about a system that failed to hear the mother screaming from inside the building. Then, buzz. My phone lit up. A photo. Bridget. In the hallway. Outside Oliver's door. Late at night. No sign in. No alert. No message. I stared at it. I didn't know who sent it. But I knew what it meant. This time, the family meeting wasn't going to be optional. By the time I pulled into the driveway of the Kersey estate, I already knew something was off. Harlan's message said, family meeting. That usually meant coffee, a few side remarks about the hospital, and a vague attempt at being civilized. What I walked into was something else entirely. Bridget was already seated, planted, at the head of the long mahogany table like she'd owned it her whole life. Harlan stood off to the side, hands behind his back like some kind of usher. And Deirdre. She smiled at me like I was a guest at someone else's party. We're so proud of Bridget's leadership, she said, like that alone should explain why I wasn't at the head of the table anymore. I nodded, not smiling back. Just quietly took a seat. My notebook was tucked inside my bag, voice recorder switched on, quiet as a breath. Let them have their moment. Bridget cleared her throat and addressed the room like she was reading from a polished script. Celine, you've done so much for this family and Oliver. But it's time we allow those who are present, committed, and involved to carry things forward. Present, committed, involved. They weren't talking about logistics. They were talking about control. That's when it hit me, they weren't just reassigning responsibilities. They were rewriting history, and I was being erased like I was never part of it. Fine. I waited. I didn't speak until the table had settled back into its polite hum. Bridget was mid-sentence when I finally interrupted. Before we go any further, I said, keeping my voice even, can I clarify a few facts? They paused. Bridget blinked. I reached into my bag and pulled out the documents. The memo from the hospital pharmacy. The logs from the night the monitors were shut off. Bridget's own signature, clear as day. I laid them on the table like poker cards. Harlan leaned forward. Deirdre's smile finally slipped. Bridget's face flushed, the color rising like someone caught red-handed but still trying to play innocent. Celine. I'm staying in this room, I said, louder this time, and I'm not stepping aside while decisions are made without me. No one said a word. The air turned stiff. That's when the shift happened, not with a bang, but with silence. The room froze, and in that stillness, I saw it, power tilting back my way. Hours later, I sat in Trina Sorensen's law office, papers spread across her desk. She flipped through everything methodically, reading like a surgeon studies a scan. Not rushed, just sharp. We have enough, she said finally, meeting my eyes. Negligence, defamation, breach of fiduciary duty, all of it. And you think it'll hold? I asked. She nodded. We're going where they can't ignore you anymore. So I signed, 1 page at a time. Complaint against the hospital, against Bridget, against the trust. This wasn't some backroom chess game anymore. This was court. Power concedes nothing without a demand, Trina said as she slid the folder shut. I exhaled slowly. Then let's make the demand. On my way out, I called a lift back to the rental. I didn't want the estate's driver hearing a single word of what came next. But before I got home, my phone rang. Unknown number. I knew that game. Ms. Varnell, a man's voice said. Hospital security. We'd like to speak with you about your recent conduct, alleged interactions with staff, possible boundary issues. They were trying to get ahead of me. I let the silence stretch before I said, you'll hear from my attorney. Then I hung up. I didn't scream, didn't call anyone. I walked inside, locked the door, pulled up the security feed on my laptop. I'd installed cameras months ago, quietly. Bridget thought she was clever, walking in and out like she still had a key to my life. I watched the footage, timestamp after timestamp. One drawer in my home office had been rifled through. A voice on my voicemail had been mysteriously erased. I took screenshots, backed up files, labeled them. Let them speak. This time, I had the mic. It was late when I finally sat with Oliver. He curled against me, his small body still warm from his bath. I read him a few pages from his favorite book, but his attention kept drifting. "Mommy," he said, "are we gonna be okay?" I didn't answer right away. I looked down at him, then pulled him into my chest. "We're gonna be more than okay," I whispered. "Because I learned something." He blinked up at me. "What?" "That being quiet doesn't save anyone." After he fell asleep, I went to the hall closet and pulled out the little bag he'd made for me at school, MOM stitched in bright blue thread. Crooked, imperfect, mine. I pressed it to my heart. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't playing polite. I wasn't waiting for permission. The future wasn't something they got to write in my name. It was mine. The sun was low by the time I opened Eileen's email. A short message, no subject line, just a single sentence. "You'll want to see this." Below it, a file. I clicked. The video opened on grainy hospital security footage, timestamped, quiet. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. Then Bridget stepped into frame, alone, shoulders hunched. She moved quickly to the alarm panel, glanced over her shoulder, typed something. Paused. Rewound. There it was again. The date, 2:07 a.m. Same night the memo flagged system errors. Same night the nurses claimed the alarms were working as usual. My breath slowed. Not rage, not even shock. Just a deep, cold stillness. Like my body knew the truth before my mind caught up. I forwarded the video to Trina. Then to one of the reporters who'd left 3 voicemails on my phone last week. "The truth doesn't arrive on schedule," I said to no one. "It shows up when you finally stop hiding from it." Everything after that moved fast. I called a meeting. Not a family meeting, my meeting. And I made sure every chair was filled. Bridget arrived last. Hair flat ironed, face tight. Deirdre followed close, pretending like she didn't know what was coming. Harlan sat stiff as a corpse in the corner. Then Oliver stood up. He hadn't said much since everything started unraveling. But that afternoon, without any prompting, he stood beside me and said in the smallest, clearest voice. "Mommy didn't leave me. Sometimes. The alarm did. That's all," he said. "That's all it took." Deirdre turned pale. Bridget looked like the floor had been yanked out from under her. I squeezed Oliver's hand. Looked around the room. "He knows," I said calmly. "And now so do you." There was no shouting, no slamming doors, just silence. That kind of silence you only hear after truth has knocked all the wind out of a lie. Later that evening, I walked into the staff meeting at the hospital. I wasn't invited, not officially. But Dr. Hasker saw me in the hallway and nodded. "Parent rep," he said. I laid everything out, neatly, fact by fact. Visitor logs, medication records, alarm tampering. Then, the video. The room went quiet as the clip played. Bridget's face on the screen. Her hands moving fast. The silence in that room felt like something alive. Hasker cleared his throat. "This isn't negligence anymore. It's misconduct." He looked right at me. "We'll be initiating internal proceedings immediately." I nodded once. Sat back. For the first time in months, my heartbeat didn't feel like a war drum in my chest. They're finally playing by my rules, I thought. But I didn't smile. You don't smile when you're rebuilding the ground under your feet. You stay still and steady. News broke within hours. A local outlet ran the story under the headline, "Hospital alarm tampered, audit underway." They used a still of Bridget walking into the security room. Her face was turned just enough for everyone to know it was her. By evening, her name was trending in hospital forums, parent groups, even Reddit threads. Deirdre texted, "We need to talk." I left her on read. Oliver and I sat together on the couch. He leaned his head on my shoulder while we watched a movie. Halfway through, I picked up the green bag, his bag, the one I used to hide. I turned it over in my lap. "You remember this?" I asked him. He nodded. I don't hide it anymore. He didn't ask why. He just leaned closer. Kids know more than they ever say. That night, I went home and set the bag by the front door. Not out of habit, out of ceremony. In my office, I pulled out a crayon drawing Oliver had left on the desk. Our house. Him. Me. A shadowy figure off to the side, barely outlined. He'd scribbled under it, "Mom, you're safe now." I held the paper for a long time. Then I started drafting a speech. Nothing grand, just a short talk I'd give at the next community event for heartchild families. Something about accountability, about standing up when standing hurts, about not letting silence become a second wound. Midnight crept in quiet. The house was still. Then my phone pinged. Email. Subject line. Settlement offer. Urgent. I didn't open it. I just stared at the screen. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The email came late. I'd been pacing in my office, trying not to look at the clock. When the ping hit, I already knew what it was. Subject line. Final settlement offer. My hands didn't shake. Not like before. I opened it, scanned the hospital's seal, then started reading line by line. They'd folded. Public apology, front page, their initiative. A medical trust for families with cardiac risk children. Bridget, suspended permanently, stripped of credentials. I leaned back, breathed through my nose. This isn't about money, I said aloud to no one. It's about rebuilding what was broken. Dad's words echoed. Some winds don't shout, Celine. They're quiet. They show up when you stay yourself, even when they try to take you down. I forwarded the file to Trina. Let's meet, I typed. But I have a few terms too. Rain started tapping on the window. Not harsh, just steady, like the beat of a heart that finally found rhythm. A knock at the door. I looked at the time, nearly midnight. I opened it to see Deirdre. No makeup, no umbrella, just an envelope. She didn't ask to come in. I owe you this, she said. I took it without a word. She left. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, then sat on the couch with the envelope in my lap. Tore it open carefully. Inside, her handwriting. Familiar curves, now stiff, hesitant. I didn't pull the wire, she wrote. But I saw it. I saw it and told myself it was someone else's mess to clean up. I thought I was protecting the family. I was wrong. I kept reading. I was scared. But I made myself small to stay safe. And in doing that, I betrayed your son. I'm sorry. I set the letter down. Walked over to the window. The streetlights cast long shadows across the wall. I whispered, even silence can be a betrayal. I stared out into the dark. My phone felt heavy in my hand. I typed, "Thank you for telling me. I'm not ready, but I'm listening. No forgiveness, but honesty?" I could meet that halfway. By morning, the rain had stopped. I pulled on my blazer, checked my notes twice, and drove to the hospital. I didn't sit in the back this time. I walked into the boardroom like I belonged there, because I did. Trina was already seated, calm, focused. The chair where Bridget used to sit, empty. The board looked stiff, nervous. "I'll start," I said. "This agreement isn't the end. It's the beginning. You can't undo what was done to Oliver. But you can make sure no other child gets ignored. No other mother has to sit beside a beeping monitor that lies to her face." They listened. "We're launching a third-party monitoring review," one of them said. I nodded. Good. That's for Oliver. And every mom who sat alone in that silence. My voice didn't crack. Not once. They'd taken enough from me. They weren't getting my strength too. That evening, I stood at the community center podium. A small room. Folding chairs. But every seat was filled, parents, nurses, a few techs from the hospital. Volunteers from the early days. All of us connected by the same kind of wound. Oliver sat cross-legged in the front row, crayons in hand. He was sketching the hospital again. This time, the alarms had cartoon eyes and goofy smiles. I looked at them, this mix of faces who knew grief, knew frustration, and still showed up anyway. "We didn't just survive betrayal," I said. "We turned it into something useful. We redefined what safety looks like in those cold white rooms. We reminded them, patients aren't data points. They're people." There was quiet. I took a breath. "Your story isn't over just because someone silenced your warning bell." I turned to the easel behind me and pulled the cover. The banner read, "Heart Safe Families Initiative, because every signal matters." And just like that, it was born. Later that night, back at home, I walked upstairs and pulled the green canvas bag off the closet shelf. The one from the day everything started. I ran my fingers over the seam. Then I placed it in a box. On the lid, I wrote in Sharpie, "Keep, but don't carry." At my desk, I opened my journal. Wrote slowly. I thought this would end with rage. Instead, it ends with responsibility. I heard little feet pad down the hallway. "Mom?" Oliver said, rubbing his eyes. "Are the alarms working now?" I kissed his head. "Yes, baby. Because now, someone's always listening." He nodded and went back to bed. The house went still. Then, my phone lit up. Unknown number. I answered. A voice, shaken. "I saw your story online. I think it just saved my son." I didn't say anything at first. Just held the phone closer to my ear. Because right then, I knew. This fight was never just about me. Or Oliver. Or even the hospital. It was about what happens when silence ends. And what begins in its place.